Filthy rat. You think you can just crawl into our lives and ruin everything? The words spat out like venom, each syllable dripping with disdain. The cold barrel of the gun pressed harder against her temple, the metallic smell of fear mingling with the stench of garbage in the alley. Officer Maya Johnson, disguised as a beggar, felt her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing the betrayal that had led her to this moment. Maya had always been a fighter. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, she had learned early on that the world was not kind to a black woman with dreams bigger than her circumstances. But tonight, under the guise of a social program aimed at understanding the homeless, she found herself at the mercy of her own colleague, Officer Jake Thompson. Jake's eyes were wild, his breath hot and rancid as he leaned in closer. You think you're so smart playing dress-up trying to catch us out? But you're just a pawn, Maya. Always were, always will be. The pain in her chest was not just from the physical threat but from the crushing weight of betrayal. Maya's mind raced, her senses heightened. The rough texture of the brick wall against her back, the distant sound of sirens that offered no solace, the acrid taste of fear in her mouth. She had to think to find a way out. But the despair was overwhelming. The next few hours were a blur of pain and humiliation. Jake dragged her through the dark alleys, his grip like a vice around her arm. He shoved her into a decrepit warehouse, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. The other officers were there, their faces masked but their voices familiar. They laughed as Jake forced her to her knees, the cold floor biting into her skin. "Look at you now," one of them sneered. The great Maya Johnson reduced to nothing. They took turns taunting her, their words cutting deeper than any knife. Maya lay on the cold floor, her body aching, her spirit shattered. She thought of her family, of her mother who had worked tirelessly to provide for her, of her younger brother who looked up to her as a hero. But hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed under the weight of despair. Maya felt it slipping away, replaced by a numbness that threatened to consume her. She had been abandoned by the very people she had called colleagues, by the system she had believed in. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Maya had lost track of time. Maya's body ached from the beatings, her ribs bruised, her face swollen. One night, as the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the warehouse roof, Maya noticed a loose board near the corner of the room. She crawled toward it, every movement sending jolts of pain through her body. Finally, after what felt like hours, the board gave way. The cold night air hit her face, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the warehouse. The city was eerily quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional stray cat or flickering streetlight. Eventually, she found herself in front of an abandoned church. Maya collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. Over the next few days, Maya began to rebuild herself, piece by broken piece. She started with small steps, cleaning her wounds with water from a nearby fountain, finding scraps of food in dumpsters, creating a makeshift bed from old pew cushions. Each task was a victory, a reminder that she was still alive, still fighting. She began to journal, using a pen and paper she had found in the church. She poured her thoughts and emotions onto the pages, writing about the betrayal, the humiliation, the pain. It was a way to process the trauma, to make sense of the chaos. And as she wrote, she began to see glimpses of the woman she had once been, the woman who had joined the police force to make a difference. But the road to healing was not easy. There were nights when the memories of Jake's betrayal haunted her, when the sound of his voice echoed in her mind, taunting her. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush her, when she wondered if it was even worth it to keep fighting. And then one day as she sat in the church, she heard a faint knock on the door. Her heart raced, fear gripping her once again. But as the door creaked open, she saw a familiar face, Reverend Thomas, a man who had been a pillar of the community for as long as she could remember. "Maya?" he whispered, his voice filled with concern. "Is that you?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, the floodgates of emotion finally breaking. Reverend Thomas rushed to her side, his presence a balm to her wounded soul. He listened as she recounted her ordeal, his eyes filled with sorrow and anger. "You are not alone, Maya," he said firmly. "We will fight this together. You are stronger than you know." With Reverend Thomas's help, Maya began to piece together the evidence she had gathered before her betrayal. She reached out to trusted allies, both within and outside the police force. It was a risky move, but she had nothing left to lose. She found an unexpected ally in Detective Sarah Collins, a woman who had always been a thorn in the side of the corrupt officers. Sarah had her own reasons for wanting to bring them down, and together they formed a plan. Maya returned to the streets, this time not as a beggar but as a warrior. She used her knowledge of the city, her connections, and her unyielding determination to gather the evidence needed to expose the corruption. It was a dangerous game, one that required her to confront her fears and face her betrayers head-on. But with each step she grew stronger. The pain that had once threatened to destroy her became a source of power. She channeled her anger into action, her despair into resolve. And as she worked, she began to see glimpses of the woman she had once been, the woman who had joined the force to make a difference. The glimmer of hope that had flickered in the darkness began to grow, illuminating the path ahead. Maya knew that the road to redemption would be long and difficult, but she was ready. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her and she had survived. And now she was determined to not just survive but to thrive. As she stood in the church, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer alone. She had allies, she had a purpose, and she had the strength to see it through. And in that moment, Maya Johnson knew that she was not just a victim of betrayal and corruption. She was a survivor, a warrior, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged. And she was ready to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. The glimmer of hope had become a flame, and Maya was ready to let it burn. The city was alive with the hum of life, but for Maya, it felt like a different world. She moved through the streets with a newfound purpose, her disguise as a beggar now replaced by the armor of determination. The scars on her body were a constant reminder of the pain she had endured, but they were also a testament to her resilience. She had been broken, but she was not defeated. With Reverend Thomas and Detective Sarah Collins by her side, Maya began to piece together the evidence that would expose the corruption within the police force. It was a dangerous game, one that required her to tread carefully, to trust sparingly. But she had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Sarah had been a godsend. A seasoned detective with a reputation for integrity, she had been investigating the corruption within the department for months. But without concrete evidence, her hands were tied. Maya's arrival changed everything. The recordings, the documents, the testimonies, they were the missing pieces of the puzzle. Together they worked tirelessly, their days blending into nights as they followed leads, interviewed witnesses, and connected the dots. It was grueling work, but Maya thrived on it. Every piece of evidence they uncovered was a step closer to justice, a step closer to redemption. But the road was fraught with danger. The corrupt officers were not going to go down without a fight. They had eyes and ears everywhere, and they were always one step ahead. There were close calls, times when Maya was sure they had been discovered, when the fear of being caught was almost too much to bear. One night, as they were leaving a safe house, Maya noticed a car following them. Her heart raced as she gripped Sarah's arm. "We've got company," she whispered, her voice tense. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she glanced in the rearview mirror. "Hold on," she said, her voice calm but firm. She made a series of quick turns, weaving through the narrow streets of the city. The car behind them followed, its headlights glaring in the darkness. Maya's mind raced. If they were caught, it would all be over. The evidence, the plan, everything they had worked for would be lost. She couldn't let that happen. Not again. "Take the next left," Maya said suddenly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "There's an alley. We can lose them there." Sarah nodded, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. She made the turn, the tires screeching as they entered the alley. The car behind them followed, but the narrow space made it difficult for them to keep up. Sarah accelerated, the engine roaring as they sped through the alley. At the last moment, Sarah made a sharp right, the car skidding as they turned onto another street. The car behind them tried to follow, but it was too late. They had lost them. Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "That was too close," she said, her voice trembling. Sarah glanced at her, a small smile playing on her lips. "You've got good instincts, Maya. We're going to need that." The close call was a stark reminder of the stakes they were playing for. But it also strengthened their resolve. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every move had to be calculated, every decision weighed carefully. As the days turned into weeks, the evidence began to pile up. They had recordings of incriminating conversations, documents that detailed the extent of the corruption, and testimonies from those who had been silenced by fear. It was enough to bring down not just Jake but the entire network of corrupt officers. But Maya knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed a plan, a way to ensure that the truth couldn't be buried. And that's when the idea came to her. "We need to go public," Maya said one evening as they sat in the church, the evidence spread out before them. "We need to make sure that everyone knows what's happening. If we take this to the media, they won't be able to cover it up." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. It's risky, but it might be our only shot. If we can get the public on our side, they won't be able to silence us. Reverend Thomas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. The community will stand with you, Maya. They've been waiting for someone to take a stand. You've given them hope. Maya felt a surge of emotion at his words. She had always wanted to make a difference, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And now she had the chance to do just that. The plan was set in motion. They reached out to a trusted journalist, someone who had a reputation for exposing the truth. The meeting was tense, the stakes high. But as Maya laid out the evidence, she could see the determination in the journalist's eyes. They were ready to fight. The day the story broke, the city was in an uproar. The headlines were bold, the evidence damning. The public outcry was immediate, the demand for justice overwhelming. The corrupt officers were suspended, an investigation launched. But Maya knew that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. The corrupt officers had powerful allies, and they would do everything in their power to protect themselves. As she stood in the church, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer alone. She had allies, she had a purpose, and she had the strength to see it through. And in that moment, Maya Johnson knew that she was not just a victim of betrayal and corruption. She was a survivor, a warrior, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged. And she was ready to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. The road to redemption was long and difficult, but Maya was ready. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her, and she had survived. And now she was determined to not just survive but to thrive. The glimmer of hope had become a flame, and Maya was ready to let it burn. The final confrontation took place in the very warehouse where Maya had been humiliated, beaten, and left for dead. It was a place that haunted her dreams, a symbol of everything she had lost. But now, it would become the stage for her redemption. Maya, Sarah, and Reverend Thomas had set a trap, luring the corrupt officers with the promise of a deal they couldn't refuse. The plan was risky, but it was their only shot. They needed to catch them in the act, to expose their corruption in a way that couldn't be denied or covered up. As the officers entered the warehouse, their confidence was palpable. They laughed and joked, their voices echoing off the cold, metal walls. They had no idea what was coming. Maya stood in the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of everything she had been through. The pain, the betrayal, the fear, it all came rushing back. But this time she was ready. She stepped into the light, her eyes blazing with determination. "You thought you could break me," she said, her voice steady. "But you only made me stronger." The officers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. For a moment there was silence, the tension thick in the air. And then chaos erupted. Jake, the man who had betrayed her, stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "You think you can take us down, Maya? You're just one woman. You're nothing." But Maya didn't flinch. She held up the evidence, the recordings, the documents, the testimonies. "This is everything," she said, her voice ringing out. "This is the truth. And the truth doesn't care how many of you there are." The officers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence wavering. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. He lunged at Maya, his eyes wild with desperation. But before he could reach her, Sarah stepped in, her gun trained on him. "Don't even think about it," Sarah said, her voice cold and steady. Jake froze, his hands raised in surrender. But the true plot twist came next, something no one, not even Maya, had seen coming. "I can't do this anymore," Jake said, his voice trembling. "I was wrong, Maya. I was so wrong." The room fell silent as Jake handed over his weapon, his head bowed in shame. It was a moment of redemption, not just for Jake but for Maya as well. She had faced her demons, confronted her betrayers, and emerged victorious. But the revelation didn't end there. As the officers were led away in handcuffs, Maya discovered something that shook her to her core. Among the evidence was a file that implicated higher-ups in the department, people she had trusted, people she had looked up to. The corruption ran deeper than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was the entire system. And now she had the power to bring it all down. As she stood in the warehouse, the sunlight streaming through the broken windows, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey ahead would not be easy, there would be trials, investigations, and the long process of healing. But she had taken the first step, and that was enough. In the end, Maya Johnson was not just a police officer. She was a survivor, a warrior, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged. And as she walked out of the warehouse into the light of a new day, she knew that she had finally found her true calling. Maya's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It teaches us that no matter how deep the betrayal, how crushing the despair, there is always a way forward. It reminds us that we are stronger than we think, that we have the power to rise above our circumstances and create a better future. But most importantly, it shows us the importance of community, of reaching out to others in our darkest moments. Maya's journey was not one she could have completed alone. It was the support of Reverend Thomas, the alliance with Sarah Collins, and the strength of her own will that carried her through. In the end, Maya's story is not just about overcoming betrayal and corruption. It's about finding hope in the darkest of places, about the power of redemption and the strength of the human spirit. And it's a reminder that no matter how far we fall, we can always rise again. The glimmer of hope that had flickered in the darkness had become a flame, and Maya was ready to let it burn. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her and she had survived. And now she was determined to not just survive but to thrive. As she walked out of the warehouse into the light of a new day, Maya knew that she was not just a victim of betrayal and corruption. She was a survivor, a warrior, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged. And she was ready to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. The road ahead would not be easy, but Maya was ready. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her and she had survived. And now she was determined to not just survive but to thrive. The glimmer of hope had become a flame, and Maya was ready to let it burn.